Leah had spent the previous evening pacing the polished metal corridors of the Nexus 9 research station, waiting for the human ship to dock. Her slender purple fingers had drummed nervously against the glowing panels embedded in the walls, and she had promised herself 100 times that she would maintain professionalism. She was, after all, a xenobiologist renowned for her thorough investigations into the reproductive biology of dozens of species. Yet none of those species had managed to confound her like the humans. Their so-called stamina remained an unsolved riddle, as she had worked for weeks to secure an in-person consultation with a male subject from Earth. That subject arrived in the form of Captain Josh Dillon, Earth Diplomatic Corps, an imposing figure who stepped through the airlock with commanding grace. Despite the station's subtle blue lighting that often warped or dimmed colors, Leah could see that he was tall, broad-shouldered, and radiated an odd mixture of relaxed confidence and barely contained power. Most males of other species in the galaxy held themselves differently. Some slouched under the weight of thick exoskeletons. Others moved with jerky motions that betrayed centuries of evolution away from upright mobility. But humans, so it seemed, carried themselves like predators. That first impression made Leah's heart flutter in her chest, and she chastised herself for losing even a shred of composure. She extended her hand and introduced herself, trying to keep her voice even. When Josh Dillon's palm met hers, she felt a distinct warmth that she had never experienced with any other species. They walked the gleaming corridors in a companionable silence, her high heels tapping softly on the floor, his boots echoing more robustly. She couldn't help stealing a few glances at his face. Humans had such expressive features compared to many others she had encountered. He turned slightly, perhaps noticing her curiosity, and she coughed to disguise her flustered state. The suit she wore, tight black leather augmented with glowing insets to track her vitals, chose that moment to display an elevated heart rate along her ribs. Quickly, she pressed a small sensor on her wrist to deactivate the display, silently cursing herself for installing such a revealing piece of technology. He didn't mention it, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. When they reached her laboratory, Leah triggered the privacy protocols. Massive doors slid closed, accompanied by a deep, resonant thud that indicated they were sealed. No one would intrude or eavesdrop. The walls curved gracefully inward, lined with holographic panels that displayed rotating images of multiple species' physiological schematics, skeletons, musculature, and specialized reproductive organs. Leah approached the nearest console and typed in a series of commands to bring up a detailed chart of human biology. She could feel Captain Dillon's gaze upon her back, though she tried to focus on the data. "I appreciate your willingness to speak with me in person," she said, turning to face him. "I've encountered a few ambiguities in the existing research on human reproductive patterns. I hoped direct observation and conversation might clarify matters." His voice was smooth, imbued with understated confidence. "Happy to help, Dr. Thean. Although I must admit, your request was quite direct and somewhat intriguing." Leah felt the faint burn of a Nexian blush creeping up her cheeks. "I'm known for being thorough," she replied, "and straightforward. Most xenobiologists would love the chance to study any aspect of human physiology, but for me, your species' daily fertility cycle, if I can phrase it like that, is especially perplexing." He chuckled softly. "We don't usually call it a daily fertility cycle, but I understand what you mean. You're referring to the idea that human men, can, in theory, mate every day without incurring damaging effects." She nodded. "Precisely. Your medical texts, combined with some scattered xenobiology reports, state that there's almost no recovery period required. My question is, how do you avoid severe tissue strain?" He set aside the helmet he had been carrying, revealing hair cropped short on the sides, slightly longer on top. "Well, the simplest explanation is that we just do. Our bodies replenish and regenerate quickly. If you want a more technical version, you'd have to explain what measurements you're after." Leah's eyes flicked to one of the holographic diagrams showing a male human's reproductive system. "I want to measure everything from cellular turnover rate to endocrine surges during sexual arousal and release. Daily activity of that sort in most species can cause microtears, hormone depletion, stress on the neural pathways, or skeletal muscular fatigue. Yet humans apparently suffer minimal to no ill effects, which is extraordinarily rare. Josh slipped off the upper portion of his uniform jacket, revealing muscular arms. She quickly averted her gaze from the play of muscle beneath tan skin. Focus, she told herself. She was here to interview him as a scientist, not ogle him. Well, doctor, he said, I'm at your disposal. If you have any instruments or scanners you'd like to use, I'm game. Leah moved to a side console to begin preparing a simple scan. Yes, I like to start with a basic physiological profile, heart rate, blood oxygenation, organ function, that sort of thing. But full data acquisition will require more direct methods. He raised an eyebrow at the direction her voice took. Are you suggesting we test the endurance factor directly? Leah's cheeks darkened again. Purely for scientific documentation. That is, once the station approves the appropriate risk and consent forms. She tapped a few commands, summoning a floating contract onto the holoscreen. Normally, I'd finalize these forms with you, but we can do it after I gather baseline readings. Captain Dillon nodded, set his gear aside, and stepped onto a circular pad in the center of the lab. Holographic sensors lit up in response. She circled him, calibrating the readings, taking note of the natural confidence in his stance. At first, she found it purely clinical, but the subtle tension in the lab's air hinted at something more. Right then, an alarm klaxon blared. Leah nearly dropped her datapad. The overhead lights shifted from soft blue to a flashing red. Intruder alert, the station's AI announced. Raiders inbound. All personnel, prepare for possible hostile boarding. Josh moved quickly, grabbing his jacket and helmet, then scanned the lab for an exit. Dr. Thean, we need to secure this area. She joined him at the door. My lab is sealed, but the rest of the station might not be. If these raiders are the same group we've heard rumors about, they specialize in stealing advanced technology and abducting valuable specimens. Josh's gaze narrowed. Specimens? As in living beings? Leah nodded grimly. They want anything exotic they can sell or repurpose, especially if it's a rare species with unique neural or genetic traits. Nexians, like me, have a high neural compatibility rate with certain illegal biotech interfaces. That makes us prime targets. He checked a small display on his wrist. My ship is docked on the other side of the station. If I can reach it, I can call for Earth backup. But it sounds like these raiders will be inside the station before I can get there. Leah's hands danced across the lab's control panel. The station security team is already mobilizing, but they're always understaffed. We're just a research outpost, not a military base. The screen showed multiple ships approaching, scanning for weak points in the station's hull. Josh, we need to hold out until the station's defenses can repel them or reinforcements arrive. He caught the urgency in her voice, stepped toward her, and set a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll manage, Doctor. Where's the nearest safe area for you? We can't risk you being captured. Her pulse stuttered at the contact, even with the klaxon still wailing. She swallowed, forcing herself to focus. Emergency lockdown procedures will seal each sector. My lab is a stronghold, technically, but they'll blow it open if they really want in. I have a small arsenal hidden here for emergencies, but you'll laugh if you see it. Mostly low-grade energy weapons. He shook his head. Anything is better than nothing. Show me. She led him to a concealed panel. Within it, a handful of compact energy pistols and a larger rifle lay nestled alongside medical kits and protective gear. Her slender, purple hand closed around a pistol. She had trained for this scenario, though she had hoped never to use that training. Josh tested one of the pistols, nodded in approval. Not as strong as standard Earth pulse rifles, but it'll do. Let's see if we can lock down the corridors leading here. Then we'll position ourselves by the entrance. The next few minutes were tense. Leah input station security codes, sealing neighboring hallways, while Josh walked the perimeter of the lab, checking for potential vulnerabilities. The overhead alarm lights cast everything in a garish red. It put her on edge, but she kept thinking of the research data, the significance of what she had discovered about human biology, and how these raiders would love to sell it on the black market. An impact reverberated through the station, rattling shelves and instruments. On the security feed, one of the raider ships latched onto an airlock in the eastern docking bay. Armed figures started pouring in. Leah could see them in sleek, dark suits with advanced weaponry. They neutralized a few security drones with unnerving efficiency. "They're cutting through to the labs," Josh said, reading the feed. "They know exactly where to go." Leah's stomach clenched. "They've been targeting research stations across multiple sectors. Ours is just the latest in a string of attacks." Another impact rocked the lab. "We can't let them get this data." "Agreed." He tapped his comm device, but static was the only reply. "They're jamming communications. We're on our own, at least for the moment." He moved to the lab's entrance, rifle at the ready. "Stay behind cover. I don't want you getting hurt." A tremor ran through her. She was used to dealing with scientific unknowns, not bullets or pulse beams. But if these raiders succeeded, they'd abduct her for her neural pathways. She refused to become a test subject. Steadying her nerves, she joined Josh behind a protective column near the main door. The station's AI blared another warning about hull breaches, then crackling blasts echoed down the corridor outside. Leah's console displayed real-time feeds. She saw the raiders closing in. The lead pair carried a portable device, likely a breaching charge. They slapped it against the sealed lab door. Josh pressed his back to the column. "Leah, brace yourself." She did, heart pounding. The explosion burst the door open with a shower of sparks. Smoke poured in, tinted red by the station's emergency lighting. Through that haze, figures stormed inside. Josh reacted instantly, firing precision shots that dropped the first two. Leah squeezed the trigger of her pistol, and a surge of energy leapt forth, striking a raider in the leg. He stumbled, crashing into a console. Adrenaline made everything hyper-clear. She saw the tension in Josh's shoulders, the set of his jaw, the controlled breathing as he fired again and again with near-superhuman accuracy. A raider almost flanked him, but Leah sent a bolt of energy that knocked the attacker sideways. Josh threw her a brief nod of thanks. Yet more raiders poured in. One loomed large in bulky armor, returning fire with a heavy cannon that forced them to dive behind cover. Machinery in the lab was demolished. Holographic panels shattered. Sparks rained down from overhead lights. Even with the advantage of concealment, Leah and Josh couldn't hold out forever. She tugged at Josh's sleeve, pointing to a small side door. "We can retreat deeper into the station. There's a secondary lab that leads to the secure archives. We might be able to lock them out there." He nodded. "Let's go." They moved in sync, Josh covering her as she dashed across the lab to a hidden door. She keyed in the override, and it slid open. He backed in after her, continuing to fire as he retreated. One raider lunged forward, but got clipped by a well-aimed shot. They slammed the door shut behind them. Leah's trembling fingers keyed a second override that reinforced the barrier with a thick titanium-like material. They found themselves in a narrow corridor with walls lined by supply lockers. The overhead lights here were dim, flickering from the damage. Another explosion shook the station, and the corridor lights went out completely, leaving only the faint glow of emergency strips near the floor. Josh placed a hand on her shoulder in the darkness. "You okay?" His voice was low, but she could hear the concern. She swallowed, adrenaline still coursing. "Yes," she managed. "I'm not used to that kind of direct conflict." He gave a slight, reassuring squeeze. "You did well. I've seen trained soldiers freeze. You kept your head." She tried to force a smile he couldn't see. Adrenaline does curious things to people. "We need to reach that archive, though. It has the data I've compiled on human biology and other species. I can't let them have it." They proceeded through the corridor, using a small flashlight from Josh's utility belt to guide them. The distant sounds of weapon fire reverberated through the bulkheads, and once in a while they felt the station shudder again. Leah tried not to think about how many casualties the station staff might be taking. She focused on the immediate mission: keep the data safe, keep herself alive, and rely on the human soldier whose presence somehow made her feel both confident and strangely flustered. They turned a corner, stepping over debris that had fallen from the ceiling. Josh paused at a door control panel. He typed a command, but the panel buzzed in refusal. "It's locked down." Leah tapped an emergency key on her wrist device. "Dr. Thean, override code Sigma 12. The door slid open with a groan. Inside was a smaller laboratory, the overhead lights flickering. Several cryo chambers lined one wall, and a large hollow terminal dominated the center. They stepped in, and Leah locked the door behind them. "This terminal has direct access to the archive. I can copy or purge the data if needed. Might be best to purge so they can't steal it." Josh nodded. "Makes sense, but do you want to lose your research?" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "No, it's months of work. Some results are groundbreaking. But if it keeps it out of Raider hands, it's worth it." He set a hand gently on her arm. "Let's see if there's another option. We could encrypt it heavily, store it in a hidden partition, or transmit it somewhere safe." She studied him in the dim light, surprised at the calm synergy he offered. "We could try to compress and transmit to Earth's secure network, but they're jamming communications." He exhaled. "Of course they are." She nodded, scanning the console. "Encryption, then. I can hide it behind multiple layers of code, with an additional biolock that only recognizes my neural signature." "Do that," he said, moving to a vantage point near the door. "I'll keep watch." Leah's fingers flew across the hollow keyboard, running lines of code. Meanwhile, the station's alarms had grown intermittent. She heard only faint echoes of conflict, but that might mean the Raiders were consolidating power. She typed faster, inputting lines of encryption that would scramble the data unless one possessed her brainwave patterns to unscramble it. Behind her, she heard Josh shift position, weapon at the ready. Despite the imminent threat, she found her mind drifting to earlier that day, to her half-finished question about how his body managed daily reproductive cycles. It was absurd, she thought, that the question that brought him here was overshadowed by a life-or-death struggle. Yet part of her realized that the reason she felt a sense of trust in him was rooted in the same fascination that led her to invite him in the first place. A clang outside the sealed door jolted her back to the moment. "They're trying to break in," Josh warned. The door buckled slightly. Leah's encryption process was nearly complete. She typed the final command. "Done," she whispered. "That's all I can do for now." The door smashed inward with a deafening shriek. Raiders poured in with raised weapons. Josh dove for cover behind a row of cryo chambers, returning fire. Leah scrambled to the opposite side, using the terminal's console as partial shield. A hail of energy bolts ricocheted, frying overhead lights and sending sparks in every direction. Josh took out 2 more Raiders with precise shots, but the barrage continued. Leah fired blindly, hoping to keep their heads down. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a bulky figure push through the door, clearly the group's leader. His armor glinted dully in the flickering light. He barked orders in a guttural language Leah couldn't translate. Several more Raiders rushed in, unleashing a fresh volley of blasts that pinned Josh behind the cryo chambers. She tried to get a better angle, but found herself pinned as well. To her horror, one of the Raiders tossed a small spherical device that clattered across the floor, rolling near Josh. He flung himself backward, but it detonated in a flash of blue-white light, releasing an energy pulse that knocked him off his feet. Leah screamed his name. He lay prone for a moment, stunned. She tried to race toward him, but the barrage forced her down. 2 Raiders advanced swiftly, one grabbing Josh's weapon, the other seizing him by the collar of his uniform. He struggled, half blinded by the pulse's after effect, but took a solid blow to the ribs. They were about to drag him away when Leah's fear gave way to desperation. She emerged from cover and fired repeatedly, scoring direct hits on both Raiders. They collapsed, releasing Josh. Another Raider aimed at her, but she dove behind the console. Her heart hammered. If they captured him, she'd lose not only a potential friend, but any hope of fighting back. Her frantic eyes darted to a side panel that contained an emergency override. She had an idea, an insane one, but possibly their only chance. The cryo chambers near Josh had an auxiliary power cell designed to maintain sub-zero temperatures if the station's main power failed. If she could reroute that energy into a short-range pulse, she might disable everyone in the lab, raiders and themselves included, for a critical few seconds. She typed into the console, ignoring the searing blast from the raiders scorching the room. Fingers trembling, she slammed the final key. The cryo chamber beeped, then a high-pitched whine rose in frequency until it peaked. A flash of azure lightning arced across the room. Every occupant convulsed as the pulse of energy surged through them. Leah felt a paralyzing jolt seize her muscles. Her vision went white. She collapsed to the floor. Everything spun. She couldn't move, but she was conscious enough to hope the raiders were similarly incapacitated. Moments or minutes later, she had no sense of time. Her vision cleared a bit. The lab was filled with a haze of smoke and the stench of burned electronics. She tested her limbs, found they responded sluggishly. Across the room, the raiders lay scattered, some unconscious, others groaning. Josh, battered but awake, was trying to push himself upright. "Leah," he croaked, voice thick with pain. "You all right?" She managed to crawl toward him. Her entire body ached, but she did her best to focus. "I'm alive," she whispered. "You?" "I'll manage." His eyes scanned the chamber. That was a hell of a last resort. She swallowed hard, glancing at the damage around them. "Let's hope it was worth it. We have to get out of here before they recover." She forced herself upright, offering him a hand. He took it, wincing, and got to his feet. They staggered through the ruined door, stepping over unconscious raiders. Alarms still echoed in the distance. Somewhere further in the station, the security forces were probably regaining some ground, or losing it. She and Josh needed to find a safer location, tend to his injuries, and figure out their next move. As they navigated the devastation, Leah's mind spun with conflicting emotions. Fear warred with relief at having survived, and an odd sense of protectiveness toward Josh. She'd never expected to feel so protective of a human. Everything she'd learned about them was purely academic, but now her personal experience told a different story. Their capacity for loyalty and bravery in the face of overwhelming odds was astonishing. Josh, teeth gritted, clutched a wound on his shoulder. Blood stained his uniform. She supported him as they crept along the corridor. "We should get you to a medical bay," she said quietly, pausing to check a map on a flickering console. He nodded, face tight with pain. "If it's still intact." They stumbled upon the station's main medical wing, only to find the door blasted open and the interior ransacked. Equipment lay in ruins, and the overhead lights flickered like a dying star. She bent over a shattered supply cabinet, rummaging for anything useful. Her fingers closed around a single injector loaded with basic Medigel and a small handheld cauterizer. Josh collapsed onto a semi-upright medical bed, breathing heavily. Leah carefully cut away the upper portion of his uniform, revealing a nasty burn on his shoulder. The pulse weapon's blast had charred the edges of the wound. She cleaned it as best she could with the limited supplies, then injected the Medigel to reduce pain and accelerate tissue repair. He inhaled sharply, eyes shut, but didn't complain. She admired his resilience. Nexians would have needed sedation for a wound like that. "Your pain tolerance is remarkable," she murmured. A faint grin tugged at his lips despite the pain. "Part of our daily endurance, perhaps." She felt her own cheeks warm at the reminder of why she had asked him here in the first place. Leaning over him, she activated the cauterizer with a low buzz. "Hold still." Carefully, she sealed the wound. He clenched his jaw, but otherwise barely flinched. When she finished, she sank onto a nearby stool. "You need rest. That's the best I can do with the supplies left here." His gaze softened. "Thank you, Leah." A moment of quiet passed. The station still reverberated with distant conflict, but they had a fleeting bubble of peace in the wrecked medical bay. She found herself studying his features again, the warm brown of his eyes, the tension of his jawline. Despite the harrowing fight and the risk of further danger, she felt an inexplicable pull toward him. Science had never prepared her for this. When the station's klaxons finally went silent, they both jolted upright. It could mean one of two things. The station's security had prevailed, or the raiders had taken complete control. Leah stood, checking a wall-mounted panel that was miraculously still functioning. The feed showed sporadic pockets of fighting, but a large number of raiders had withdrawn. It looks like the station's defense systems are coming back online, she observed. They must have realized we're not as easy a target as they hoped. Josh exhaled, relieved. That means reinforcements might have arrived, or the station's partial defense grid got reactivated. Either way, we should regroup with any survivors and see what the situation is. They left the ruined medical bay, making their way through corridors littered with debris. Occasional bodies, both raiders and station staff, lay unmoving, and Leah's stomach churned at the grim reality. Josh pressed on stoically, though she could see the weight of it in his eyes. Eventually, they reached the command center. The heavy doors bore scorch marks, but were still intact. A battered security officer recognized Leah and let them in. Commander Hluck, a stern-faced Korean with ridged blue skin, stood at a central console coordinating final sweeps of the station. Relief flickered across the commander's features upon seeing Leah. "Dr. Thean, Captain Dillon, you're alive," Hluck said, voice terse but grateful. "We've driven off the last of the raiders. They retreated after sustaining losses, but we suspect they'll be back. Are you two all right?" "We'll manage," Josh answered, "though the lab areas are in shambles." Hluck grimaced. "They hit us harder than expected. We've lost good people, and they seem particularly determined to access your research, Doctor." Leah steadied herself, her heart pounding. "They didn't get it. I encrypted everything." "Good. We need to keep that data secure, at least until we know why they wanted it so badly." The commander gazed at her. "Any theories?" Leah exchanged a glance with Josh. "The only guess I have is that my focus on human physiology, especially reproductive endurance, somehow attracted their interest. There's something about human adaptability they were after. Possibly they believe there's a hidden application for it, perhaps genetic or neural in nature." Commander Hluck crossed her arms. "I'll assign more security to your lab. Meanwhile, I want a full damage report from both of you once you've tended to your injuries." Josh saluted. "Understood, Commander." Leah sighed with relief as they exited the command center. She felt her adrenaline crash, and suddenly exhaustion took hold. Josh placed a guiding hand at her elbow. "You look like you need rest." She nodded. "My quarters are near here. They might be intact. It's safer than the lab right now, which is half destroyed." He accompanied her, watchful for any lingering threats. Thankfully, the corridors near the command center were relatively unscathed. They arrived at her quarters, and she keyed the door open. Inside, the lighting remained intact, illuminating a surprisingly cozy space compared to the sterile labs. Soft drapes, cushions, and decorations from Nexian culture lent warmth to the metallic environment. Leah let out a tired sigh. "Thank the stars. I wasn't sure what to expect." She gestured for Josh to enter and sealed the door behind them. "I have a small medical kit here, too. Let me double-check that wound." He lowered himself onto a cushioned seat while she fetched the kit from a drawer. She knelt beside him, scanning the burn with a portable device that beeped softly. No sign of infection. The cauterizing held. "But you need more advanced treatment once the med bay's fully operational again." He gave a weary smile. "I'll be fine. Thank you." Silence stretched between them, tension from the battle lingering like a ghost in the air. Then Josh reached out and gently brushed a strand of Leah's silvery hair aside. She froze, heart drumming faster than it had during the firefight. "You put yourself at risk back there," he said quietly. "You saved me." Her voice came out hushed. "I couldn't let them take you. And you saved me more than once. It's what allies do." A flicker of emotion passed in his eyes. "Allies, yes. But it feels different than that." She swallowed. A swirl of emotion she'd been trying to ignore now churned with unstoppable force. "We come from vastly different species, Josh. There's no guarantee that." He leaned in, his free hand catching her trembling fingers. "No guarantee of what? That we can't care about each other, or that we can't find out how far our compatibility goes beyond pure science. Her breath caught. She remembered every bit of her professional curiosity that had originally driven her to request a human subject. The data pointed to humans having uncanny adaptability. But data and real feelings were two different realms. She found herself leaning closer, drawn to the warmth of him, to the sense of security he offered in a station suddenly fraught with danger. The near-kiss moment was interrupted by a beep on her wrist device. She startled, glancing down to see a security alert. "Commander Hook wants me in the command center for a quick debrief," she murmured. "Station protocols." Josh exhaled, looking a bit frustrated and amused. "Duty calls." She stood, trying to reassert her professional bearing. "Yes, we'll talk later." He gave her a slight nod, though his eyes lingered on her with an intensity that left her legs unsteady. "I'll stay here, patch myself up, make sure your quarters remain secure." She left him with a final glance, stepping into the corridor, mind swirling. The idea that she, a Nexian xenobiologist, could be developing personal feelings for a human soldier was about as improbable as the notion that humans could mate 365 days a year without physical damage. Yet both improbabilities seemed real now. Over the next few days, the station's repairs began in earnest. Security patrolled every corridor, patching breaches, repairing critical systems. The remains of the raiders' ships had vanished, either destroyed or fled. An uneasy quiet settled over Nexus 9. Leah spent hours each day in the lab, or what remained of it, salvaging data and rebuilding her research environment. Josh, meanwhile, helped bolster the station's defense protocols, training a small security team to respond more effectively should the raiders return. Their schedules kept them apart more than Leah liked. She caught sight of him now and then, exchanging nods across corridors, running into each other in the cafeteria line for a moment of shared laughter over the bland station rations. Every time, she felt that same tension. She remembered the near confession in her quarters. Something had changed between them. Late one evening, after the station's overhead lights dimmed to simulate nighttime, Leah closed her newly reconfigured lab. Exhaustion weighed on her. She walked the nearly empty corridor toward her quarters, only to find Josh waiting at her door. He looked up, a small smile forming. "Thought I'd check if you were okay," he said. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm just tired. But yes, I'm okay. Thanks for asking." He hesitated, then gestured to her door. "May I?" She keyed the lock and let him in. Once inside, she kicked off her shoes, sighed, and collapsed onto a small couch. He stood near the entrance, one hand on the back of a chair, as if uncertain what else to do. "How's the wound?" she asked. He rotated his shoulder. "Better, every day. That Medigel you found did wonders." They fell into a silence that was both comfortable and charged. Finally, Leah laughed softly, running a hand through her hair. "I'm so used to analyzing everything with a scientific lens, and now I don't even know where to begin with this." He moved closer, taking a seat across from her. "With us, you mean?" She nodded. "Humans fascinate me, and not just academically anymore. The question I started with, how your bodies endure so much daily reproductive activity, has led me to discover you're so much more than those biological stats." He reached out, took her hand. "Maybe we can pick up that research in a more controlled environment." His tone was playful, but sincerity underlay it. Her pulse skittered. "If it means continuing to learn about your physiology, I won't object." She paused, eyes scanning his face. "But you should know, it won't be purely academic." "Not for me." He smiled, leaning in. "Not for me either." Their lips met, and Leah felt every nerve ending ignite. Her species, the Nexians, were known for high neural sensitivity. The mildest of touches could send waves of sensation. She had never truly tested it with a human's chemistry. Now, her entire system jolted like it had been waiting for this. When they finally broke apart, a shared breath of astonishment escaped them. That was, he searched for words. "Incredible," she finished. "Your adaptability extends to kissing, apparently." A low laugh rumbled in his chest. "You should see what else we adapt to." She smacked his shoulder lightly. Don't get ahead of yourself, soldier. They ended up talking for hours, the station's simulation of night passing. She learned about Earth, about how humans had once been considered behind other advanced species, but had proved surprisingly resilient in every major conflict. He listened with genuine interest as she described Nexian neural pathways, how certain stimuli were amplified for her species, which was both a blessing in fields like medicine and a curse in high-stress environments. Eventually, they sought rest, but not before exchanging gentle explorations that left her mind spinning at the potential complexities of Nexian human intimacy. He was mindful of her sensitivity, and she discovered that the simplest contact sparked exhilarating sensations. By the time he left for his own quarters, dawn had arrived in station terms. She shut the door with shaky hands, pulse still hammering, and realized that question about human stamina had only been partially answered. If these first gentle moments were any indication, the real data would surpass every hypothesis she'd ever made. A few peaceful weeks passed, the station gradually returning to normal. Leah's research continued. While the official story was that she was examining differences in immune responses across species, her personal files documented far more intimate data. She took discreet readings after her encounters with Josh, marveling at the speed at which he seemed to recover from, and, indeed, crave daily physical closeness. That aspect, combined with the heightened reactions of her own Nexian body, led to nights that redefined what she thought biology allowed. With each passing day, though, a nagging concern grew. She had begun to experience unusual symptoms, mild dizziness, occasional waves of nausea, and an inexplicable surge in her neural readings. She tried to dismiss them as side effects of stress. The station's morale was still fragile, and the looming threat of raiders returning weighed heavily on everyone. Yet, deep down, Leah knew her body well enough to recognize that something was off. One afternoon, after nearly fainting in the lab, she decided to run a full medical scan on herself. The station's med bay had been rebuilt enough to allow private diagnostics. Securing the door behind her, she stepped into the scanning chamber, letting the swirling beams of light read her vitals. She closed her eyes, waiting. The scanner beeped. She stepped out, walking to the console where results would be displayed. Her eyes swept the screen, reading heart rate, neural patterns, hormonal levels. She froze. It couldn't be. She ran the test again, certain there was an error. The result was the same. Pregnant. Not only pregnant, but the scan indicated twin embryos with a mix of Nexian and human DNA. She sank into a chair, shock waves pounding her. Nexians had almost never been known to conceive children with other species unless advanced genetic manipulation was involved. Spontaneous cross-species pregnancy was unheard of, yet the holographic display confirmed it, showing two distinct life signs in early development. A swirl of fear, wonder, and confusion overtook her. She reached out to steady herself on the edge of the console. In the quiet, as the reality sank in, the fear began morphing into cautious excitement. A child, or children, shared by her and Josh. A union that shouldn't be possible according to every xenobiological text. This discovery alone would rewrite so many scientific principles. The uniqueness of human adaptability, combined with Nexian physiology, had created something extraordinary. Her comm beeped, startling her. Josh's voice asked for her. "Leah, are you there? Commander Hlook wants us in the briefing room." Something about Raider intel. She swallowed hard, forcing composure into her tone. "I'll be right there." She needed to tell him, but not over a comm line. This news was too big, too personal. She locked down her medical records under encryption that only she could access, then left the med bay, her thoughts spinning with every step. When she arrived in the briefing room, she found Josh and Commander Hlook already deep in discussion. They looked up as she entered. Hlook pointed to a holographic map. "We've received reports that the raiders who attacked us are regrouping at a nearby station. They might be planning another assault, but they might have found new buyers for stolen tech. We have to stay vigilant." Leah managed a nod, though her heart hammered for entirely different reasons. She tried to listen, but every time she glanced at Josh's profile, her mind whispered, "He's the father of my children." The phrase felt surreal, like it belonged to someone else's story. She forced herself to focus on the commander's words about strengthening station defenses. After the briefing, Hook left them alone. Leah gestured for Josh to follow her into a side corridor. "Can we talk privately? There's something important you need to know." He grew concerned at once. "What's wrong?" She led him to an empty lounge area, locked the door, and activated the privacy setting. Then she simply stared at him for a moment, trying to find the right approach. Finally, she gave up on elegance and spoke plainly. "I ran a medical scan on myself. I've been feeling off lately. Josh, I am pregnant." His eyes widened. Silence reigned for a long moment. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing the word. "But you're Nexian. I'm human. How is that possible?" She shook her head, tears threatening. "I don't know how, biologically speaking, except that it must be related to your species' adaptability. The scans confirm it's a dual embryo. Twins, a boy and a girl, if the markers are accurate. They share both your DNA and mine." He took a halting step forward, then placed both hands gently on her shoulders. "Twins, are you all right? Are they healthy?" She nodded, voice quivering. "So far, the scans indicate they're developing normally. But this is uncharted territory. Cross-species pregnancies without genetic engineering aren't supposed to happen." He let out a breath that sounded half laugh, half disbelief. Then a slow, odd smile spread across his face. "You're carrying our children." He pulled her against him, arms wrapping around her. She exhaled, realizing that part of her had feared rejection or panic from him. Instead, he held her like the precious cargo was as much his concern as hers. After a moment, he pulled back to look into her eyes. "We have to keep this quiet, don't we? If the raiders find out, or anyone who wants to exploit this discovery." She nodded fiercely. "Yes, we can't trust just anyone. These children would be living proof of something that could attract dangerous attention." His gaze flicked to her abdomen. "I'll protect you and them with my life." Emotion clogged her throat. She had never expected to find such commitment from an alien soldier she'd only recently met. Then again, humans specialized in the unexpected. She pressed her hands over his. "We'll figure this out one day at a time." They confided in only a select few station personnel, including the medical officer, who discreetly confirmed the pregnancy and pledged to maintain secrecy. Commander Hook suspected something was going on, especially when Leah requested additional security measures around her lab. But Leah fed the commander a partial truth about sensitive new data. That seemed enough to satisfy official channels, at least four. Now, meanwhile, the demands of the station pressed on them. Systems needed repairs, visiting delegations needed attention, and the looming threat of another raider attack hung over everyone's head. Leah found herself juggling physical fatigue from her pregnancy, the desire to further study how a human's reproductive cells had triggered conception, and her mounting affection for the father of her children. One evening, she sat at a console in her quarters, analyzing the genetic readouts of the twins. Josh was beside her, scanning the data. It was astonishing. The human telomeres appear to have an ability to interface seamlessly with Nexian chromosomes, effectively bridging the gap that usually rendered cross-species conception impossible. No wonder the raiders have been so eager to grab that data. Whoever mastered this technique might open a Pandora's box of accelerated evolution and hybrid creation across the galaxy. She rubbed her belly absently. It was still early in the pregnancy, so there wasn't much visible change, but she felt the subtle differences in her body. She blinked at the console, exhaustion heavy in her eyes. Josh noticed and gently took the datapad from her hands. "That's enough science for one night. You need rest." She leaned into him. "I keep thinking about what this means for the galaxy. For us. For these children. They'll be the first of their kind. What if the station's not safe enough? The raiders are still out there." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "We'll do everything to keep them safe. We'll adapt, right? Humans are good at that, and Nexians are no slouches either. We'll make it work." A small smile curved her lips. I don't know if I'll ever fully adapt to the speed at which humans tackle problems. But I'm glad you're here with me. He held her in comfortable silence for a while. Then, as if cued by some cosmic sense of timing, the station's alarm blared again, cutting through the moment. They both shot upright. Leah's heart lurched, and she exchanged a grave look with Josh. This time the alarm had a different pitch. A voice crackled over the intercom. Hostile vessels detected. All security teams to battle stations. Josh immediately keyed his comm to speak with Commander Hook, who confirmed that the raiders had returned, this time with heavier ships. They were scanning for weaknesses in the newly repaired hull. Leah felt dread coil in her stomach. Josh turned to her, face resolute. You stay here. Lock down your quarters. I'll coordinate with Hook and the security teams. We can't risk you. Before he could finish, a violent shudder rocked the station. Sparks showered from overhead lights, and the floor beneath them groaned ominously. The emergency backup lighting kicked in, bathing everything in a dim, flickering red. No, Leah said, forcing steel into her voice. I can't just hide. I need to protect my research data. It's why they're here. If they catch me off guard, it's over. I should try to reach the secure archive and wipe it if they breach. Josh's jaw tightened. Fine, but stick by me. I'm not letting you out of my sight. Together, they hurried into the corridor, which was already ablaze with emergency signals. Crews ran back and forth, and squads of armed personnel rushed to strategic points. Josh guided Leah toward an elevator that could take them closer to the secure archive. But halfway there, an explosion on a lower deck rattled the entire structure, and the elevator seized, lights flickering out. They were forced to take the emergency stairwell, descending into a region of the station that still bore scars from the previous raid. Josh remained at her side, weapon drawn, scanning for any sign of raider infiltration. Leah clenched her own sidearm, mindful of her unborn children's vulnerability. That knowledge empowered her with an unexpected surge of resolve. She refused to let the raiders claim this station or her family. On a lower deck, they encountered the first wave of intruders. The corridor was choked with smoke. Josh led the way through the haze, firing at silhouettes he recognized as raiders. Leah stayed behind him, returning fire whenever the chance arose. A sizzling shot whizzed past her ear, forcing her to duck. Her heart pounded, fear coiling in her chest, but she channeled it into fierce determination. They reached a junction near the labs, only to find a group of station security pinned down by a squad of raiders using advanced shielding technology. One of the security officers had collapsed, wounded. Josh immediately moved to help, while Leah risked a glance around the corner, spotting a group of raiders trying to force their way into the archive wing. She tapped her wrist device, but the station's intranet was unstable under the assault. She only managed to get a partial signal through to Commander Hook, who responded with static-laced instructions to hold them off until reinforcements could arrive. A tall order, given how outgunned they were. Josh coordinated with the pinned security team, instructing them to lay suppressive fire while he and Leah maneuvered closer. She swallowed her fear and followed him, adrenaline fueling each step. The memory of how her improvised blast had saved them once before flickered in her mind, but she had no such trick this time. It was down to raw skill and determination. They pressed forward under the covering fire, inching toward the archive doors. Josh took precise shots at the raiders' shield generator, hoping to disable it. Meanwhile, Leah fired from the other side, drawing their attention. Energy blasts filled the corridor with furious flashes. At last, Josh landed a direct hit on a key component of the shield generator, causing it to sputter and fail. The raiders, momentarily exposed, scrambled for new cover. Seizing the moment, Leah sprinted to the archive door's control panel. It was jammed. She cursed, swiftly inputting a bypass code. "Come on," she muttered. "Open up." Behind her, Josh held off a pair of raiders who had regrouped. She heard him grunt with effort, heard the sizzling discharge of pulse rifles. Her code finally took. The archive door slid open. "Josh!" she shouted, waving him over. He dashed in her direction, narrowly dodging a bolt of energy that scorched the wall. She tapped the panel from inside, sealing them in. The comm system crackled, and they heard the station's AI announce that hull integrity was compromised in multiple areas. They might not have long before the station started losing atmosphere pressure. Inside the archive, hush enveloped them like a sanctuary, if only briefly. Stacks of data modules lined the walls, each containing invaluable research from countless species. Leah hurried to the main console and typed in her encryption, preparing to do the unthinkable, purge her life's work. She hated the idea, but it was better than letting these raiders seize the data, especially the part about human-Nexian compatibility. Josh stood guard, glancing between her and the door. "We can't let them break in here." She initiated the purge sequence, which required multiple biometric verifications. "I'm wiping everything except a hidden backup I placed under advanced encryption. That backup is physically stored in a single data crystal in my quarters. Let's hope they never find it." She tapped the final command. Lines of code scrolled across the screen as entire databases began disintegrating. The station shuddered again, and a low rumble reverberated through the floor. Over the archive speakers, Commander Hlook's strained voice came through. "All hands, brace for critical damage. Raiders have planted charges near the station's power core. We're trying to disarm them. Prepare for possible evacuation." Josh cursed under his breath. If the charges go off, the station might not survive. The final lines of the purge completed, and Leah exhaled a shaky breath. "Then we need to get out of here. But we can't let them take us, especially me." He strode over, setting a hand gently on her lower back. "We'll make it out. We're not losing you or our children." He peered into her eyes. "Ready to move?" She nodded. They left the archive, stepping back into the corridor that was now littered with unconscious or retreating raiders. The station's security forces had pressed forward, it seemed, driving them back in a pitched fight. Smoke and sparks made everything disorienting. Once in a while, they saw the flash of gunfire or heard the hiss of an energy blade. The near-constant tremors of the station suggested the power core area was near meltdown. Suddenly, from a side corridor, the bulky leader who had haunted Leah's memory from the previous attack emerged with a group of raiders. He spotted her immediately, pointing. "That's the Nexian," he growled in a rough accent. "Get her." Josh shifted to intercept. "Run," he yelled to Leah, raising his weapon. She hesitated, not wanting to leave him, but knew she had to follow his direction. She sprinted down the corridor, searching for another route that might lead them around these raiders. Josh fired at the group, taking a few down, but the leader charged forward, shrugging off one pulse blast thanks to thick armor. He barreled into Josh, sending him crashing against a damaged console. Leah turned back in horror. The leader pinned Josh's weapon arm, raising a blade. "No!" She raised her own pistol, heart pounding. The leader's minions aimed at her. She dived behind a collapsed piece of debris. She heard a yell from Josh, then the clang of metal. Risking a glance, she saw Josh grappling with the leader, who was every bit as strong as he looked. They exchanged blows, each staggering. Meanwhile, the other raiders advanced on Leah's position, forcing her to retreat deeper behind rubble. A flash of inspiration hit her. She spotted an overhead pipe that looked severely damaged. If she could shoot it at the right angle, maybe it would collapse onto the raiders. She took aim, though her hands shook from adrenaline. Focusing, she fired. The shot hit the pipe's weakest seam. A cascade of sparking wires and twisted metal fell, burying two of the raiders in an explosion of debris. The leader was narrowly missed, but his subordinates were neutralized. Josh seized the distraction. With a fierce shove, he disarmed the leader, delivering a disabling blow with the butt of his rifle. The man crumpled. Josh stumbled, panting, leaning against the wall. Leah rushed to his side. "You okay?" she asked, voice shaking. He nodded, eyes blazing with adrenaline. "Let's keep moving. That's probably not all of them." He paused, looking at her intently. "You did great." Her heart pounded for 1,000 reasons, not least of which was the primal fear of losing him. She placed a hand over his chest, felt the hammer of his heartbeat. Then they heard another rumble, more violent than before, and an ominous hush fell over the station's intercom. Over a garbled channel, Commander Hlug's voice announced that the charges near the power core were about to detonate, and an evacuation order was in effect. The station was lost. "We have to get to the emergency pods," Josh said, his voice nearly drowned out by the alarm that suddenly resumed, screaming that meltdown was imminent. Leah's stomach dropped. The place she called home for so long was about to be destroyed. But she had no choice. They sprinted along battered corridors, joined by panicked researchers and security personnel. Even some of the raiders seemed to be fleeing, presumably to their own ships. Smoke poured in, and the lights flickered. The pods were located near the station's midpoint. They careened around corners, crossing collapsed sections and shattered bulkheads. Once or twice, they had to climb over wreckage. The station gave a monstrous groan, metal twisting under catastrophic stress. A wave of hot air singed their faces, and Leah realized the meltdown was only seconds away. With a final sprint, they reached the pod bay. About half a dozen pods remained, each capable of carrying a handful of people. Hurried staff were cramming inside, securing harnesses. Josh rushed Leah into the nearest one, following behind her. As soon as they were seated, an automatic sequence slammed the hatch shut. She caught a glimpse of flames licking the far side of the bay before the pod ejected from the station. Gravity lurched. They plummeted away from Nexus 9, inertial dampeners struggling to keep up with the speed. Through the small viewport, Leah saw the station in its final moments. The meltdown flared with a brilliant explosion of light that burst out from the station's core. A chunk of the structure broke away, sending debris scattering into the void. The entire scene was surreal, heartbreak layered with relief that they had escaped in time. Tears streaked Leah's cheeks. She pressed her hand to the viewport, grief for the station that had been her home and workplace, for the staff who might not have made it off in time. Josh's arm encircled her, pulling her close. For a moment, they just breathed, the hum of the escape pods' engines the only sound besides their rattled hearts. An automated voice announced that the pod was heading for the nearest safe harbor, an orbital platform that had responded to the station's distress signals. Leah buried her face in Josh's chest, mourning the end of her research center, anxious about the future of her unborn children, and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had lost and what she still had to protect. Hours later, they docked with the orbital platform. Medical teams checked survivors. Commander Hlug had made it out in another pod, battered but alive. Various staff members converged, stunned to learn that Nexus 9 was gone. The immediate threat of the raiders had receded. Some had perished in the meltdown, others fled, but no one doubted that new threats would emerge once word spread of the station's destruction. In the days that followed, Leah and Josh, along with a handful of other survivors, began regrouping. Earth's diplomatic corps offered them sanctuary, acknowledging that Josh had discovered vital new data about interspecies compatibility. Leah, carrying the living proof of that data, agreed to relocate to a secure research outpost. Commander Hlug expressed relief that at least some portion of Leah's knowledge had survived. Though the meltdown had erased the physical station, Leah still possessed a hidden data crystal containing her final encryption. That data, combined with the unborn twins, could spark a galaxy-wide shift in how species interacted. Perhaps, in time, they could rebuild. Maybe they would create a new institute dedicated to peaceful exploration of cross-species possibilities. One evening, in a quiet suite aboard an Earth vessel, Leah sat with Josh on a small couch, watching the starfield slip past a panoramic window. She rested a hand on her belly, now beginning to show a slight curve. Josh gently placed his hand over hers, a soft smile on his face. "Do you regret it?" he asked, voice nearly a whisper. She turned to him, brows knitting. "Regret what?" "Inviting me to Nexus 9 with that question about daily stamina. Everything that happened afterward. The danger, the destruction of the station. Do you wish it never happened?" Her gaze flicked to the stars, remembering the halls she once walked daily, the lab filled with cutting-edge tech, the colleagues she might never see again. A pang of sorrow rippled through her. But at the same time, She felt the flutter of movement within her, the miraculous proof of what their two species had achieved together. She shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I don't regret it. We lost a lot, but we gained something unprecedented. You're proof that human resilience isn't just about daily mating. It's about courage, adaptability, and love." He leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "And you showed me that life is worth more than any diplomatic assignment, that sometimes the most profound discoveries come from being willing to cross boundaries we never thought possible." They kissed gently, a promise to each other and to the future they had inadvertently created. Outside the window, stars stretched on for light years in every direction, an endless horizon of possibility. Deep in Leah's heart, hope kindled. The research station might be gone, but the spark of a new legacy lived on, growing inside her, waiting to usher in the next chapter of interspecies collaboration. And it all began with a single question. How can humans mate 365 days a year without breaking their tool? The answer, it turned out, was far more profound than any scientific report could capture. It was more than a question of biology. It was a lesson in how life itself, unpredictable and boundless, could defy every limitation and create something beautifully impossible.